Hello everyone, so today we are going to talk about one of Foucault's books, The Birth of the Clinics, and we are going to talk about chapter 9, The Invisible Visible. So let's start with the 5 principles that define the rules of pathological curses and the possible path that it must follow. And the first principle is the principle of tissue communication. So it's said that each type of disease has its own pathological modality or structure. So it basically means when a tissue or organ is affected, it may affect other parts as well. So one example is that if a brain are inflamed, the sensitivity of the eyes and ear are sharpened, so the organ can affect each other. So here comes to the second principle, the principle of tissue impermeability. So Foucault said that morbid diffusion is a matter of isomorphic surface, not proximity or superposition. So which means that the functional unity and the position of two organs don't force a pathological fact to another, but follow the pathological rules. So one example is that sympathetic vomiting is not concerned to mucous membrane of the stomach, but the fibrous tissue, which means that the organ doesn't get affected because it's just close to another organ. So the third principle, the principle of penetration by boring. So it's kind of weird that it's limit the previous 2 principles when we talk about in a long period of time. So if an organ get affected for a long period of time, it will prevent the neighboring tissue to perform their function. For example, like cancer, when you have a cancer for a long time, it may affect other organs to perform their complete functioning. The fourth principle is the principle of specificity of the mode of attack on tissue. So the nature of disease have different mode of attack. So there are 2 modes that it mentioned. One is aberration and one is alteration. Aberration means that the tissue is already exists in body, and the alteration mean that a new tissue is created within the body. So different kind of disease have different mode of attack. So the last principle, the principle of alteration of alteration. So a disease can encourage another disease development. One example is inflammation of lung does not constitute tuberculosis, but encourage. These rules shows us that the disease is a pathological life, a living thing. Before that, disease used to be seen as a chaotic, counter nature and distortion of life. This kind of perception of disease being changed is because of the anatomical gaze. The anatomical gaze changed how they see death. Death was the point of view from heights of which disease opened up into truth. Disease now can be specialized and individualized. And a new reversal of the relation between sign and symptoms show up. In the earliest from clinical medicine, every symptom was a potential sign, and the sign was simply a red symptom. But in anatomical gaze, symptom remains silent, and the essential with which one believes it to be unproof, to be non-existent. In order to explain this, Foucault used the perception of Zimmermann and Pina. They think when a sign is more certain, it occupies more surface. For example, fever is the major symptoms and the most certain sign, which closest to the essential. And a series of disease could be recognized by. On the other hand, Laennec found a certain sign of pulmonary phthisis. He examining patients who he believed to be suffering from pulmonary chorale. He met with the same phenomenon in about 20 patients. Then he distinguished it from fairly similar phenomenon to be observed in pleurisy patients. The sound was more than naturally sharp. It seems thin and quivering, and this becomes the only certain signs of pulmonary physis, not a series of disease that could be recognized, which is symptomatic extension. That's no longer the value of sign. Sign now no longer speak natural language of disease. It speak within the question posed by medical investigation. Therefore, the anatomical gaze needs to map the volume to establish the sign. So it needs the sensorial triangulation: ear, touch, and sight. One example of that is doctors start listening to the patient's chest using stethoscope. So let's talk about the difference in clinical sign and anatomical clinical sign. The clinical sign is referred to the disease itself, and the anatomical clinical sign is to the lesion. Foucault used Covisart to explain this. He takes his patient's pulse. It is not the symptom of an affection that he seeks, but the sign of lesion. This is an example of absolute gaze, which dominates and founds all perceptual experience. This gaze needs a lot of information under straight rules and gather them into certain sign. And this is the invisible visible, which is the knowledge of the individual. The knowledge that develops in accordance with a whole interplay of envelopes under straight rules. So how these kind of invisible things become visible? In another way to say this, how to make a disease that we can state in language. Because visible is mean that it can be stated in language, and the invisible is the gaze, which is lack of words. Putting words into invisible, which in Foucault's words is an arduous, delicate work, a work that reveals. Because there are lots of rules to use words, and you have to describe in a lot of details. Laennec does the job by describing disease of liver. He described the size like 2/3 of an epigastrium, the color white, the texture, for example, surface was smooth and without wrinkles. And he also used cherry as a metaphor to describe the size of tuberosities and compare the color to the color in normal stage. He used words to describe the individuality and details of disease. So the invisible are visible now, and this is what organizes an animal pathological perception. So when we look into a bigger picture, we can look back to Renaissance. In that time, death is a dance of skeleton depicted on the underside of life, a sort of egalitarian Saturnalia. Everyone is the same and equal. But the anatomical gaze, the perception of death, is constitutive of singularity, where the individual find themselves escaping from monotonous average life. In conclusion, the anatomical gaze changed the way we look at death and disease. Death no longer the end of life. It tells the truth of life. Disease no longer chaotic, but a pathological life. It also creates a new reversal of the relationship between sign and symptom, To conclude in Foucault's words is that death left its old tragic heaven and become the lyrical core of man, his invisible truth and his visible secrets. And that's the end of my video. Thank you for watching my first ever video essay. Bye.